We are accustomed to watching democracies fall with a bang, the thunder of troops, the slam of a prison door. But there is another, quieter path to failure, one where the erosion is subtle, incremental, and often televised. Political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt argue that modern democracies are not typically murdered, they are instead slowly suffocated from within. The guardrails, the unwritten rules of mutual tolerance and institutional restraint, are dismantled, piece by piece, by elected leaders themselves. Drawing from a lifetime of studying democratic breakdown across the globe, Levitsky and Ziblatt trace how these fatal patterns, once confined to fledgling republics, have begun to appear at the heart of the oldest democracies. The story of a democracy's end is not merely one of a single demagogue. It is a story of what the establishment chooses to tolerate and what, ultimately, it chooses to defend. We pictured the smoke over a capital city. We pictured Hawker Hunter jets screaming over the presidential palace in Santiago, dropping bombs until the stone crumbled. We pictured the man with the guns seizing control, while the democratically elected president issued one final, defiant broadcast to a silent nation. This was the Cold War template: sudden, violent, and unmistakable. But today, democracy dies differently. It doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with a whisper. Modern democracies are rarely toppled by generals. They are dismantled by the very people the public voted into office. These leaders don't scrap the Constitution, they use it. They don't ban elections, they win them. It is a slow, barely visible erosion. By the time the alarm bells ring, the foundations are already gone. History shows us that every democracy faces two critical tests. The first test comes before a would-be autocrat ever takes power. Look at Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, he wasn't a dictator. He was a populist outsider promising to cure a corrupt system. To his supporters, he was the antibiotic for an infected body politic. He held free elections and wrote a new constitution. But step by step, he packed the courts, bullied the press, and triggered legal investigations into his rivals. It was all legal. It was all democratic. It took nearly 20 years for the world to finally admit that Venezuela had become an autocracy. This is the electoral road to breakdown. There are no tanks in the streets. People still vote. The newspapers still publish, though they've been intimidated into self-censorship. Because there is no single moment of collapse, the public stays confused. Those who scream fire are dismissed as alarmists. The second test comes after the leader takes office. We spent decades studying these failures elsewhere, across Europe, across Latin America. We thought we were studying other people's history. But now, we are looking in the mirror. We tell ourselves the United States is different. We have a robust middle class and a centuries-old constitution. But institutions are not enough. A constitution is just a piece of paper. To work, it needs soft guardrails, unwritten rules, mutual toleration, forbearance. Today, those guardrails are thinning. We failed the first test in 2016 by electing a leader with clear authoritarian tendencies. Now we are facing the second. Will our institutions hold, or will they be weaponized? The threat is not a sudden coup. It is a gradual drift into the fog of extreme polarization. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. If we listen closely, we can hear the rhythm of past failures in our own headlines. The question is whether we can find the rhyme before the music stops. It begins not with a bang, but with an invitation. Rome, October 1922. Benito Mussolini arrives by overnight train. He wears black, a bowler hat, a black jacket. He has been summoned by the king to form a government. Later, the story would harden into myth. Black shirts marching on the Capitol, a liberal state collapsing under revolutionary force. But the truth was quieter and more dangerous. Mussolini commanded just 35 parliamentary votes. His squads were scattered, often hungry, often unarmed. What he possessed was leverage, the threat of violence, a divided political class, fear of socialism, and elites convinced they could use him to restore order. They handed him the keys. Markets surged. Elder statesmen applauded. They told themselves this was temporary, a tactical alliance. Italy soon found itself under the bit and spur. This story isn't Italian. It's a blueprint. A decade later, Germany stood paralyzed. The economy was collapsing. Parliament was deadlocked. Conservative leaders searched for a way out. They despised the outsider who commanded mass loyalty. They believed they could contain him. One of them waved away concern. Within 2 months, he said, they'd push him into a corner. The outsider was Adolf Hitler. And in Venezuela, the pattern repeated again. In 1992, a young officer named Hugo Chavez appeared on television after a failed coup, telling his followers to stand down. He was jailed. Then a respected insider intervened. Former President Rafael Caldera stood before Congress and spoke with sympathy about the rebellion's grievances. The speech revived Caldera's career. It also legitimized Chavez. Later, as president, Caldera dropped all charges. When Chavez walked out of prison, a reporter asked where he was going. To power, he replied. 5 years later, he arrived. Different men, different continents, the same fatal logic. These leaders did not seize power through coups. Power was handed to them, or the door was quietly opened. Seasoned politicians, facing crisis and fearing chaos, made a devil's bargain. They believed they could borrow the outsider's energy, then restrain him. They were wrong. This failure is often misdiagnosed. It's tempting to blame the people, to assume democracies fall because voters abandon democratic values. The record doesn't support that story. Before Hitler and Mussolini took office, majorities opposed them in free elections. In Venezuela, on the eve of Chavez's victory, support for democracy was higher than in countries that remained stable. The decisive failure wasn't mass enthusiasm. It was elite abdication. Political parties are the real gatekeepers of democracy, and in these moments, the gatekeepers failed. So, how do you recognize an authoritarian before it's too late? Sometimes the signs are obvious: failed putsches, paramilitary violence. But not always. Some cloak their intentions. For those cases, a behavioral test helps. Watch for leaders who reject the democratic rules of the game, who deny the legitimacy of their opponents, who tolerate or encourage violence, who show a willingness to curtail civil liberties, especially for critics and the press. A single warning sign is enough. Populist outsiders, those who claim to embody the people against a corrupt elite, trigger these alarms most often. When they reach power, institutions tend to weaken, not strengthen. History also shows this outcome isn't inevitable. In Belgium in 1936, a fascist movement surged. The mainstream Catholic Party faced a choice: ally with extremists on its right or unite with longtime rivals on the left. They chose democracy. They expelled sympathizers. They formed a broad coalition. The threat was contained. Finland did the same. Austria did the same in 2016, when conservative leaders crossed ideological lines to block a far-right presidency. It split families. It cost political capital, but it worked. The formula is simple and brutal. Keep extremists off party tickets. Remove them from your ranks. Refuse alliances. isolate rather than normalize. And when the danger becomes real, put country before party. For most of its history, the United States practiced this kind of gatekeeping. Extremists existed, but they were kept at the margins, until they weren't. The lesson of history isn't that democracies die in darkness. They die in broad daylight, with a handshake from those who were meant to guard the door. Imagine this: 1940. Charles Lindbergh, aviation hero, isolationist, Nazi sympathizer, flies into the Republican convention. Delegates erupt. Lindy! Lindy! They nominate him on the spot. He becomes president, signs treaties with Hitler, unleashes violence against Jewish Americans. It's fiction. Philip Roth imagined it. But history nearly whispers the same question. What if someone like Lindbergh could bypass the system? We had plenty of would-be demagogues. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, reached 40 million listeners a week, praised Mussolini, declared elections pointless. Huey Long, Louisiana's kingfish, built a movement of millions, flouted the law, and said, "I'm the Constitution just now." Joseph McCarthy terrified the country with anti-communist witch hunts. George Wallace rallied white working-class voters with raw, racialized anger. All had tens of millions behind them. So why didn't they seize the presidency? Because America had gatekeepers. Picture Chicago, 1920, sweltering heat. 9 ballots deadlocked the Republican convention. In a smoky hotel suite, party bosses debated, negotiated, filtered. They chose Warren G. Harding, a dark horse. Popular opinion meant nothing. The back room mattered. Party leaders weren't virtuous. They were cautious, risk-averse, terrified of extremists derailing the system. And they kept figures like Henry Ford out, despite polls showing him crushing every other contender. This filter went back to the founders. Alexander Hamilton warned that men who rise by pandering to fear often end as tyrants. He created the Electoral College to screen candidates. Political parties later inherited that gatekeeping power, balancing 2 duties: reflecting the voters and protecting the republic. For decades, it worked. Demagogues could roar in the streets, win fans, dominate media, but without insider support, they could not reach the White House. Then 1968 happened. Assassinations, Vietnam spiraling, Chicago convention violence broadcast nationwide. The old system cracked. Americans demanded change. The McGovern-Fraser reforms created binding primaries. Voters, not party bosses, chose the candidates. For the first time, the gates could be bypassed. Experts warned it could be dangerous, and for a while, outsiders still failed. Money, media, and allies in every state, the invisible primary, kept the system from breaking entirely. But the filter was weaker. The back rooms were gone. The stage was open. And one day, a man could walk right through. June 15, 2015. New York City. Trump Tower. A man in a red tie steps off a gilded escalator and announces he's running for president. To the experts, he was a sideshow, a reality TV star chasing a few more months of the spotlight. He held extremist views and a history of birther conspiracy theories. The media mocked him. Bookmakers gave him 100-to-1 odds. By the old rules of American politics, he should have vanished before the first frost. For nearly a century, party elites were the gatekeepers. Governors and senators vetted candidates in smoky rooms and back-channel deals, filtering out the demagogues before a single ballot was cast. But the gates had been tampered with. Reforms in the 1970s opened the primaries to the will of the people, a move intended to democratize politics that inadvertently left the system without locks. The gatekeepers hadn't just lost their keys, they had lost their teeth. Two modern forces finished the job: money. Decisions like Citizens United allowed outsiders to bypass party funding entirely, relying instead on a few billionaires or a million small cliques. And media. The rise of a conservative entertainment complex meant that fame could be shouted into existence. Trump didn't need the party's blessing because he had $2 billion in free media coverage. He was a candidate uniquely tailored for the digital age, where controversy is the only currency that matters. The warning signs weren't subtle. Even before the general election, he tested positive on every indicator of the authoritarian litmus test. He questioned the very rules of the game, claiming the election was rigged and refusing to promise he'd accept a defeat. He denied the legitimacy of his rivals, branding them as criminals who belonged in jail. He didn't just tolerate violence, he courted it, offering to pay the legal fees of supporters who struck protesters. Finally, he threatened the civil liberties of his critics, promising to open up libel laws to punish the press. No major party candidate in 100 years had met all four criteria. The alarms were deafening, but the response was a hollow silence. History tells us that when a demagogue rises, democracy only survives if the mainstream unites to isolate them. We saw this in Austria. We saw it in France. Conservatives there endorsed their own ideological rivals just to keep extremists away from the levers of power. They understood that losing an election is a temporary setback, but losing democracy is forever. American leaders chose a different path. While a few retired officials broke rank, the men in power, the speakers and the majority leaders, fell in line. They didn't isolate the crisis, they normalized it. They turned a fundamental threat to the republic into a standard red versus blue contest. In a polarized nation, a normal election is a coin flip, and when the coin landed, the system blinked. Democracy is only as strong as its guards, and in 2016, the guards simply stepped aside. Alberto Fujimori didn't plan to be a dictator. He was a political nobody, a university rector who rode a wave of populist anger into the Peruvian presidency. But once in power, he found democracy to be an intolerable frustration. To him, Congress was a room full of charlatans, and the Constitution was a straitjacket. He didn't have the patience for the slow, grinding work of negotiation. On April 5, 1992, he walked onto national television and simply dissolved the system. But Fujimori is a rare case. Most modern democracies don't die in a single violent explosion. They die through a slow, legal rot that is often imperceptible to the people living through it. To understand this process, imagine a soccer game. If you're a would-be autocrat, you don't start by canceling the match. You start by rigging the field. The first step is to capture the referees. In a healthy democracy, the referees are neutral arbiters. The courts, the tax authorities, and the intelligence agencies. Their job is to prevent cheating. But an autocrat fills these agencies with loyalists. Suddenly, the law is no longer a shield for the public, it's a weapon for the leader. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán didn't abolish the courts, he just expanded them and hand-picked the judges. In Peru, the intelligence service didn't just fire opponents, they filmed them taking bribes or entering brothels to ensure their cooperation through blackmail. Once the referees are bought, the leader turns to the star players, the opposition. Most contemporary autocrats don't wipe out dissent with a firing squad. Instead, they use a veneer of legality to sideline anyone capable of hurting them. They offer a mafia deal to media owners and business titans. Support the palace and receive government contracts, or stay independent and face a $2 billion tax audit. In Russia, Vladimir Putin told the oligarchs they could keep their billions as long as they stayed out of politics. Those who refused didn't disappear. They were arrested for fraud. With the opponents hobbled, the autocrat rewrites the rules of the game. They change the constitution and the electoral laws to ensure the House always wins. They gerrymander districts and pass reform measures that make it harder for the other side to vote. We saw this in the American South after Reconstruction. To comply with the letter of the law, states introduced neutral literacy tests and poll taxes. These weren't called racial laws, they were called good, square, honest laws. But their only goal was to legally wipe out the opposition vote for a century. The final, most dangerous tool is the crisis. A war, a terrorist attack, or a natural disaster creates a rally-round-the-flag effect. In these moments of fear, the public is most willing to trade liberty for the promise of safety. Whether the crisis is real or manufactured, like the suspicious bombings Ferdinand Marcos used to justify martial law in the Philippines, it provides the ultimate exit from the constraints of democracy. By the time the smoke clears and the public realizes the game is rigged, the referees are paid, the opponents are silenced, and the gates are locked. The transition is complete, and it was all done by the book. We like to think of our Constitution as a fortress, a sacred blueprint that protects us from the whims of tyrants. But look closer at history, and you'll find an unsettling truth. Paper alone is never enough. Germany's 1919 Weimar Constitution was a legal masterpiece, yet it collapsed under Hitler in months. Argentina copied our Constitution almost word for word, only to endure a century of military coups and fraud. The Philippines did the same in 1935. It took just one man, Ferdinand Marcos, to brush it aside. The reality is that every constitution is incomplete. No manual can anticipate every crisis or define every boundary. Our own system has massive gaps. It doesn't stop a leader from filling the FBI with loyalists or ruling by unilateral decree. We rely on what scholars call thin tissues of convention. When we rely solely on the written word, we're like workers on a work-to-rule strike, following the contract to the letter until the factory grinds to a halt. To understand how a democracy actually survives, look away from the marble halls and toward the asphalt of a pickup basketball game. There are no professional referees on a street court. The game only works because of unwritten rules. You call your own fouls, you check the ball to ensure the defender is ready, and you don't play to start a fight. These are the soft guardrails. Without them, the game descends into chaos. Two specific rules hold the American project together. The first is mutual toleration, the radical idea that our rivals have a right to exist. We may find their ideas foolish or their characters loathsome, but we don't view them as an existential threat. It took decades for the founders to realize they could lose an election without losing their country. When this fails, as it did in 1930s Spain, we stop seeing rivals and start seeing targets. If you believe your opponent will destroy the world, you'll do anything to stop them. The second guardrail is institutional forbearance. This is the act of not doing something, even if you have the legal right to do it. It is the patient self-control of a leader. For 150 years, the two-term limit for presidents wasn't a law, it was a norm set by George Washington. Ambitious men like Jackson or Grant could have run for a third term legally. They didn't. They knew that pushing the system to its absolute limit would eventually break it. The opposite of restraint is constitutional hardball. This is playing for keeps. It's using the law as a weapon to permanently disable an opponent, packing courts, or impeaching leaders on a whim. It's technically legal, but it violates the spirit of the law. In Chile, this hardball turned a stable democracy into a graveyard. By 1973, politicians had checkmated the system until it had nowhere left to go. These norms are like oxygen. You don't notice them until they're gone. When winning becomes more important than the rules the parchment in the archives won't save us. The question we must face now is what happens when those soft guardrails aren't just leaning, but have finally snapped. March 4th, 1933. Families huddle around their radios in the dark. They hear Franklin Roosevelt's voice, steady and thunderous. He is asking for a power usually reserved for a foreign invasion. He wants to wage war against the Great Depression. But Roosevelt soon hits a wall. The Supreme Court begins dismantling his New Deal. To the President, the court is a relic. To the court, his agenda is a violation. So Roosevelt reaches for a gap in the Constitution. He proposes adding 6 new justices, men he would hand-pick. He tries to pack the court. On paper, this is legal. The Constitution doesn't specify how many justices must sit on the bench. Yet the plan dies. It isn't killed by Roosevelt's enemies, but by his own party. They recognize a line that shouldn't be crossed. They know that if the court becomes a partisan plaything, the entire system collapses. Our Constitution is a remarkably brief document. It is full of silences. It is not a self-executing machine. For a democracy to survive, it requires something the ink cannot provide. It needs unwritten rules. It needs guardrails. The first guardrail is mutual toleration. It is the radical idea that our rivals are not enemies of the state. We accept their right to exist, to compete, and to govern. When this fails, politics becomes an existential struggle. We saw this in the 1790s, when the founders suspected each other of treason. We saw it in the 1850s, when the debate over slavery turned the floor of Congress into a place of stabbings and canings. The second guardrail is institutional forbearance. This is the art of not doing something just because you can. It is the deliberate underutilization of power. A president has the legal right to pardon themselves. A Senate has the power to filibuster every single bill. But if they did, the government would grind to a halt. For most of the 20th century, these guardrails held. George Washington set the tone. He possessed immense prestige and could have ruled like a monarch. Instead, he stayed in his lane. He knew he gained power by his readiness to give it up. This restraint became the DNA of the Republic. But the peace of the 20th century came with a tragic cost. After the Civil War, the two parties only learned to live together by removing racial equality from the agenda. The 1877 Compromise ended Reconstruction. It effectively told the South, you can keep your racial hierarchy if you stay in the Union. This is the great paradox. The norms of civility we remember were built on a foundation of exclusion. The parties got along because they were both parties for white men. They didn't view each other as threats because their fundamental interests weren't being challenged. When these norms were tested, the system responded. Joseph McCarthy tried to weaponize fear. Richard Nixon tried to weaponize the state itself. In both cases, the guardrails held because the resistance was bipartisan. Republicans stood with Democrats to say, this is not how we do things. The guardrails are not just about the law. They are about the spirit of the law. If we lose the unwritten rules, the written ones will not be enough to save us. On a Saturday afternoon in February 2016, a single tweet ignited a firestorm. Justice Antonin Scalia was dead. Within hours, before the body was even cold, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a decree. The vacancy would not be filled until a new president was sworn in. For 150 years, the Senate had followed an unwritten rule. If a president nominates a justice, the Senate gives them a hearing. But the world had changed. By refusing to even consider Merrick Garland, the GOP didn't just break a precedent. They trampled a guardrail. They stole a seat, and they got away with it. Many blame Donald Trump for this chaos, but the unraveling began decades ago, led by a history professor with a Politics as Warfare manual, Newt Gingrich. In 1978, Gingrich told young Republicans to stop using Boy Scout words. He told them they were fighting a war for power. He began using adjectives like rocks, calling rivals pathetic, sick, and traitors. He transformed political opponents into immoral enemies. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a strategy of constitutional hardball. In the 90s, it led to government shutdowns and the impeachment of Bill Clinton on a technicality. In the 2000s, it led to the hammer, Tom DeLay, who famously said, "If it wasn't illegal, do it." By the time Barack Obama was elected, the spirit of cooperation was dead. A new movement, the Tea Party, didn't just disagree with the president, they questioned his right to exist. They claimed he was a secret Muslim, a socialist dictator, a man who was not a real American. And then came the most notorious birther of all, Donald Trump. By 2011, nearly 40% of Republicans believed the president wasn't born in the U.S. Intolerance was no longer a fringe hobby, it was the party's fuel. When mutual toleration dies, forbearance follows it into the grave. The GOP became the party of no. They filibustered everything from judicial nominees to innocuous conservation bills. They took the U.S. debt limit hostage, threatening to crash the global economy just to score a point. The congressional watchdog had become a partisan lapdog. Why did this happen? Because the two parties are no longer just divided by policy, they are divided by identity. For the first time in history, partisanship, race, and religion have converged. The GOP has become the party of white Christians, while the Democrats have become the party of everyone else. This has triggered a profound status anxiety. As the country changes, a segment of the population feels like strangers in their own land. They fear the real America is slipping away. To them, politics is no longer a competition. It is an existential fight for survival. Your way of life, you will do anything to stop them. You will break every norm. You will shatter every guardrail. By 2017, the guardrails were still standing, but they were paper thin. And the man who had spent years leaning against them was about to walk through the front door. Donald Trump's first year in office followed a script that was all too familiar to students of history. Like Fujimori, Chavez, or Erdogan before him, he began his tenure not with policy, but with a blistering rhetorical assault on the very institutions meant to check his power. He called the media the enemy of the American people. He questioned the legitimacy of judges. He threatened to defund major cities. To many, it felt like chaos. But to an authoritarian, it was an attempt to capture the referees. He demanded a pledge of loyalty from the FBI director. When he couldn't get it, he broke an 80-year precedent and fired him. He attacked the so-called judges who ruled against his travel ban. He even pardoned a political ally, Joe Arpaio, bypassing the Justice Department entirely, sending a clear message that the law could be used as a political tool. But in that first year, the guardrails held. Not because the president lacked the instinct to break them, but because he was contained. Key members of his own party, senators like McCain and Graham, drew a red line at the firing of James Comey. They protected the special counsel, Robert Mueller. They ensured that for a time, the referees remained independent. However, there is a more subtle danger than the breaking of laws. It is what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan called defining deviancy down. When a president lies every single day about the weather, about his inauguration crowds, about millions of illegal voters, he isn't just being dishonest. He is shifting the standard of what we consider acceptable. He is expanding the toolkit of future politicians to include bullying and deceit as legitimate tactics. We see the cost of this erosion in the public mind. By 2017, nearly half of Republican voters believed the 2016 election was rigged. More than half said they would support postponing the 2020 election if the president asked for it. When citizens lose faith in the integrity of the vote, the very foundation of democracy begins to crumble. Trump may not have dismantled the constitutional guardrails in his first year, but he scraped against them like a reckless driver. He showed us that the greatest threat isn't just a sudden coup, but a gradual carnage of the norms that keep us free. The guardrails held in 2017, but the question remained, how much more pressure could they take before they finally snapped? For generations, we've leaned on the comforting myth of American exceptionalism. We believed our Constitution was a masterpiece of political engineering, a machine so perfectly designed that it could run itself, regardless of the flaws of the people at the wheel. But history, when viewed through a somber lens, reveals a much harder truth. Our system isn't a machine. It's a set of shared understandings, and for over 2 centuries, those understandings have been underpinned by the dark currency of racial exclusion. The stability we remember from the mid-20th century was real, but it was bought by keeping millions of citizens on the outside. When we finally chose to become a full democracy in 1965, it triggered a massive earthquake in our partisan identity. That earthquake hasn't stopped. It has realigned our parties into 2 camps that no longer see each other as rivals, but as existential threats. As we look toward the horizon of a post-Trump America, we are staring down 3 possible paths. The first is a swift recovery, a return to a normal that likely never existed. The second is a much darker road, where one party uses the tools of constitutional hardball to engineer a permanent majority, using voter purges and surgical gerrymandering to ensure they never lose again. The third road, and perhaps the most likely, is the North Carolina model. It's a state of permanent institutional warfare. In North Carolina, we see what happens when the soft guardrails of mutual tolerance and forbearance finally snap. We see a legislature that strips a governor of power before he even takes office. We see courts shrunk or expanded just to steal judicial appointments. When you stop seeing your opponent as a legitimate contender for power, the entire system begins to hover on the brink of a permanent crisis. There's a natural human impulse to fight fire with fire. We hear voices calling for the opposition to fight dirty, to obstruct every prayer and boycott every inauguration. But look at the wreckage of Venezuela. When the opposition there tried to topple Hugo Chavez through coups and strikes, they didn't save their democracy. They gave the autocrat the moral high ground and the perfect excuse to crush them. Mirrors don't save systems. The lesson from successful resistances, like the one in Colombia, is that you must use the institutions to save the institutions. This means building what the authors call uncomfortable coalitions. It means progressives sitting down at the table with red state business leaders and white evangelical Christians. If you make a policy litmus test, like abortion or healthcare, the entry fee for the defense of democracy, you will find yourself standing alone. Saving the republic requires us to swallow hard, set aside our most cherished disagreements, and find common moral ground with people we might otherwise despise. The burden of change is not distributed equally. The Republican Party, once anchored by a strong establishment, has been hollowed out by outside donors and extremist media. It has become vulnerable to a sugar high of populism and nativism. To survive, it must look to the German model after the Second World War. The center-right in Germany rebuilt itself by ruthlessly expelling its own extremists and building a base that was conservative, religious, and, crucially, pro-democracy. For the Democrats, the trap is different. The temptation is to win back the white working class by abandoning identity politics or diluting the rights of minorities. The authors warn us. That is the road to our most shameful historical mistakes. We are currently in our third great attempt to build a truly multi-ethnic democracy. The first led to civil war. The second led to Jim Crow. We cannot afford to fail a third time. The real solution is universalism. When we build social policies that are means-tested and narrow, we create resentment. We create the welfare queen myths that politicians use to divide us. But when we build policies like Social Security and Medicare, programs that belong to everyone, we build bridges. An economy that addresses the stagnant wages and rising inequality of the last 40 years is an economy that takes the oxygen away from the fire of polarization. Democracy is not a song that has gone bad. It is an idea that hasn't been disproved yet. It depends on what the writer E.B. White called the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It depends on the don't in Don't Shove. No single leader can end a democracy, and no single leader can rescue one. It is a shared enterprise. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booth and the feeling of communion in the library. Ultimately, the fate of the American experiment depends on us.